Hello and welcome back to the workshop. Last we left you, we were working on the neck. I've got the rest of this carved out roughly to where it needs to be. It's down to thickness, and we've gotten the curve to where the volute is going to go. Now I'm going to set this aside for the time being, and I'd like to get the fretboard squared away. So for starters, I need to plane this down to thickness, and I need to cut off the excess so that I can start slotting the frets before we cut it down to shape. Alright, so what I have gone ahead and done is I've trimmed it down to close to the width, leaving myself some extra room to play. But I've also gone ahead and marked out where some of the frets that I'm going to be using for the alignment are. So I've got 24th fret down here, I've got my nut up here, and I'm actually making square my 10th fret. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to slice those so that they are exactly where they need to be. And then I'm going to proceed to radius. That way I know exactly where my fret markers are, so that I can then mark out the rest of the frets when it is down to radius. I do it this way because I find that the granadillo that I use is a pretty hard wood and likes to chip away very easily, even with a really sharp plane. So I find that by not slicing it, it reduces the amount of tear out there is when I am planing it down to the radius. So I'm very simply going to have it clamp down into my jig here so that then I can slice these three main points, which will give me the rest of the points that I need to then cut the rest of the frets. Alright, so now that I got those three markers, I am going to go ahead and trim off the extra on the top here. That way I can mark where my center lines are going to be on the very edge here, so I can remark it once I get the radius on there. So just as before, I'm going to use the trick and put this on my bench so that I can then come with my hand plane and put that radius on there. Now that I got the radius roughly on there, I've gone ahead and I've marked to the inner part of my final dimension for my fretboard. So I'm going to trim those excess parts off, square it up, and grab a couple pieces of maple that I'm going to use for the binding. I want to stick as close as possible to that gold and red theme I'm going for, so I think the maple will act very nicely, because when you put a oil on it, it gets kind of a goldish color. So I'm going to go trim these down, and I'm going to trim some binding parts too, and then we'll be back and we'll start slotting this fretboard. Alright, so now that I've trimmed it down to about the width that I want, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these excess lines and I'm going to clamp it down to a flat surface on the edge here so that I can run my hand plane against here. This is a very simple way to do it if you don't have a shooting board. I do have a shooting board made, but just for the sake of showing you that it can be done with that one, I'm going to do it this way. And you're going to line up your edge line with where the end of this board is, so that then you're just shaving off until you hit the board that you're lining up with. Now there are many different planes that you can use with this method. You can use a number 5, a number 4, a number 6. You can even use a block plane. I'm going to use a block plane on this one because it's smaller and I'll have more control. You just want to make sure that the bed and the side of the plane that you're using is square, so that you're running against a flat surface and that it's going to be flat against the board, so you're getting a nice 90-degree straight cut. All Now, as you can see, this method squares it up pretty quickly. I've got a little bit of cleanup to do on the edges here, but we are just about there. And we are nice and straight all the way across. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this around, do the same thing, line it up on my lines, and then I'm going to go ahead and plane that down to thickness. Then we can start working on the binding and cutting the fret slots. All right, now that I got two straight edges, I'm going to go ahead and take my fret ruler here and a pencil, and I'm going to mark out where all my frets are. Most people don't necessarily have a jig, and I didn't for a long time either. And to be quite honest, cutting frets is really not that hard. As long as you go slow and you've got a good saw to cut them with. There's two good types of saws that you could use. You can use a flush cutting saw. This is a Japanese saw that I retrofitted with a guide so that I could have a stop for where my fret tang is going to end. You can also use a fretting saw, which is very similar, but it has a much wider blade. This is not a very expensive one, but it cuts just fine. With this one, I would generally put a piece of masking tape to mark where I'm going. I'm first going to go through and score all of my fret slots so that the saw has something to rest in, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to cut them all by hand using those knife points that I scored in there to then keep the saw in line with where I need to be. If you have a Kiradashi, there's not enough good things I can say about these things. I love this. This is my go-to for marking. But any old knife really would work. If you have a razor blade, that would also work to mark these. All you're going to do is very carefully score a line across where you just marked all those frets. And then that is going to be where your saw then falls. And just like that, we've got a fully slotted board. I'm going to go ahead and take a sanding bar to this to clean up the edges here. And then after I do that, I'm going to then mark out all my binding and cut off the excess at the top here where the nut goes so that I can then get my measurements for how much of the binding I need. I'm going to go ahead and use these cutoffs of this flamed maple, which was cutoffs from the neck. That way I can stick with that red and gold theme here. And because these are already squared up, all I really need to do is trim them down and glue them in place, and we'll be good to go. Alright, so now that I've got it this far, I'm just going to go ahead and glue these pieces of binding on. It's a little cumbersome, but we're going to let it dry, come back, shave off the excess, and then do the end of it. Alright, we've got the binding on. It is close to the width it needs to be. I'm just going to go ahead and do the same trick I did to straighten out the fretboard and put it on the edge of this flat board here and run my hand plane against it. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Why don't you just set up a fence on your bandsaw or your table saw, or run on a belt sander? Well, one, my new belt sander is still on back order, so I'm currently out a belt sander. And two, in my opinion, power tools like that are more for hogging out large amounts of material rather than getting to the finished product. I trust my hands far more than I do a power tool. So in this case, a hand plane is the tool for the job. So I've got some serious sanding to do, but this has given me a good perspective on where the strings are going to fall. So I'm going to have to take away these corners here and make an angle. So I think that somewhere in here, at an angle to the fretboard, matching that, and somewhere about maybe halfway into where the truss access is, I'm going to just make a chamfer right in there, and then I'm going to blend everything together. Alright, now that we have it this far, I think that I am more than happy with where I'm at. So I'm going to go ahead and glue the fretboard onto the neck so that from there I can then start shaping it. So let's glue it on. Alright, now that we got it clamped up, we're just going to go ahead and let this thing dry. So now that I got the fretboard glued down and I know that the edge is nice and straight, I'm just going to take a bearing cutter on my router here and run across that edge to straighten out the neck, so that way I can get the depth and get to carving. We're nice and flush. Now all I need to do is get the depth marked on here, and then I can start carving out the shape of the neck. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go 23.5 to 24.5 at the 12th fret and go with a standard C-shaped neck. So if my fretboard is 6 millimeters, then I just need to take that depth off and mark it at where the neck joins in there. And that gives me my final depth there. So now I just need to go ahead and carve it flat, just as I've done before, and then divide it out to round out the neck. And then from there I'll figure out what I want to do with the heel and the volute. Alright, as you can see, we are just about there. It's nice and straight. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up with a planer before I go ahead and start marking out where I'm going to be carving. So just as I've done many times, draw a line down the middle and divide it in quarters, divide it in half on the side, and I'm just going to keep carving around those curves until I've got a nice rounded profile on here. And then that'll give me the starting point to then carve the heel and the volute. Spoke shave, you can use a draw shave. My favorite is the Shinto rasp. It makes quick work of it. It's just a bunch of tiny saw blades, and honestly it's one of my favorite tools and pretty much lives on my bench at this point because I use it so frequently. Not only just for necks, but for everything. I'm going to keep cracking away at this, and we'll come back once we've got a shaped up neck. And in about 20 minutes, I've got a nice rounded C profile. From here, now that I've got it rounded out, I mainly just go off of feel. So if I think it's too bulky in some places, I will then take more material off the back end here. But a little chunky is not too bad on a hollow body. So I'm just going to start dialing it in. As a rule of thumb, I don't like to carve up to the fretboard if I've already got it down to the width that I want. That way I don't risk taking off any extra material and changing this line. When you're setting your bridge, you like to use these straight lines to set them in place. It's a lot easier to do it off of these lines once they're straight rather than trying to make sure that the center line is spot on with a straight edge. Now, for those, I use both methods, so it's not going to be the end of the world, but I don't like to get too close to the edge of the fretboard. I tend to get real close, and then whatever I miss, I can clean up with a sander later. I think I'm going to go semi-traditional. We're going to have this edge curved off here, and then it come and swoop into the neck from there. So for this job, I usually use a half round rasp, a gouge, and just some carving tools. Alright, and I think I'm pretty happy with where that's contoured at, so we just need to clean some of that up. It's definitely the chunkiest volute that I've ever made, and part of that is because of the headstock design. Alright, we've made a lot of headway. You could say I'm neck and neck with where I want to be. I think we've made a lot of progress, so I think that I'll leave this here for now. All that we've got left for this neck is to finish shaping the heel block, which I think after I get done and shaped, I want to add a cap to the back of, because I think that where I place that post is going to be a little shallower than the body. So we'll get that sorted out once we do the heel, which we'll do the next time around. We have a lot of sanding to do, which that part I won't bore you with. I may just do that off camera because I could do an entire video just on sanding. And then we've got to sort out the inlays. Now I have an interesting idea for the inlays, so I'm going to run a couple tests. And given how those tests work out, that may be what ends up on this fretboard here. Don't forget, this is part of the Great Guitar Build-Off. Go ahead and check out everyone else in the build. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Please hit that like button. And leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think of this build so far. As always, we'll see you in the next one. Stay tuned.